Thank you for coming in on a Monday morning, right after a long weekend, in what is a very pleasant April so far in Delhi. The CPR is very pleased to welcome Dr. Priya Deshinkar, who is speaking today on low-skilled migration and precarious work. Where do the borders of forced migration begin and end? In this talk, Priya will be looking at locations around our region in Bangladesh and Nepal, but also in countries in Africa, and explore the tension that sort of is there between migration as what used to be the formal dichotomy, the old dichotomy between push and pull, migration as opportunity, and migration as necessity. Given Priya's extensive work and international expertise in this area, I'm sure we're in for a very enlightening morning. Priya is currently at the research director of this Migrating Out of Poverty Research Consortium, and where she is the principal investigator for the Capitalizing Human Mobility for Poverty Alleviation and Inclusive Development in Myanmar project, and the senior research fellow at the School of Global Studies at IDS. And she has a PhD from the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex, and her landmark book, which set off a long debate on what exactly is the extent of migration in India, is Circular Migration and Multi-Locational Livelihood Strategies in India, which was in 2009. And Priya, of course, would have been pleased to see that this year's economic survey speculated about numbers of migrants in India that were much closer to her end of the spectrum than the numbers generated by the NSS and the census. But that is, I'm sure, topic for not this lecture, but I'm sure something that she could be willing to entertain if it came up during Q&A. So Priya, floor is yours. About 45 minutes, and then we'll just open up the floor. Thank you.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. It's a huge pleasure for me to come here. It's been a number of years since I came to CPR, and I'm very pleased to see such a nice turnout. I wasn't expecting more than a handful of people because it's been a holiday and lots of people must have gone away. And the weather is truly pleasant. I was almost dying on the metro just now coming in. Okay, so I have 45 minutes and I have a lot of ground to cover, so please excuse me if I seem like I'm steaming through the slides, but we can come back during the Q&A and pick up on any points that you want to take further. So my topic today is low-skilled migration and precarious work. Where do the borders of forced migration begin and end? And this is to highlight some of the current debates around low-skilled migration. So the aims of my talk are to draw on research conducted in different locations in Africa and Asia, including India. As Partha said, I have been involved with the Migrating Out of Poverty Research Consortium, and we work in East, West, and Southern Africa, as well as South Asia and Southeast Asia. So I have a very large portfolio of research projects on migration that I've been overseeing, and in addition to that, we've started work in Myanmar recently, and I'm going to Nepal tomorrow to wrap up some of the work there. So it's been quite a big and diverse set of projects. It's good because I can bring out some of the commonalities in what we've been seeing there today. So the objectives of this talk are to discuss the conditions in which low-skilled migrants are recruited and employed, the contrasting discourses on their experience, so the way that that kind of migration is being discussed in academia or in the public discourse, and the way that it's discussed by the migrants themselves, and the often complex and contradictory outcomes of migration. So there's no straightforward outcome. There are usually mixed outcomes, both good and bad. And this, of course, creates difficulties for analyzing it in terms of clear dichotomies of either forced or completely free labor. And finally, I'll touch on some of the policy implications of these findings, all, of course, if I have time. So I wanted to begin with discussing some of the basic assumptions that we tend to make about migration into low-skilled work. And to do that, I will focus on domestic work and construction work, which are very, very important for migrants from rural areas and disadvantaged backgrounds. So according to the ILO, there are something like 63 million domestic workers in the world today. 83% of them are women, and there are 180 million construction workers. A lot of these people are migrants, and these figures do not include under 18-year-olds. And as you know, many of the workers in both of these occupations are often children. So the significance is enormous. So I'm sure all of you here have also been thinking about why people migrate into such work. Is it push or is it pull? And what forms of migration do they engage in? How should we label this kind of migration? Is it precarious work? Is it distress migration? Is it debt migration? Is it trafficking? Recently this word trafficking has come into the local parlance a lot more, and of course there are a number of sort of political stroke economic reasons why that's been pushed a lot by international agencies as well as NGOs working in the field. So how should we analyze it? And is it forced or not? To what extent are choices to go into this type of work made voluntarily? So these are the sorts of questions and the objectives of my talk today. So I'll just run through a few sort of theoretical positions on migration, because that often underpins the assumptions that we make about migration. So if you look at early modernization and neoclassical theories of migration, they viewed migration as an integral part of development. So it was a natural process that happened when countries develop. And it's a factor that equalizes inequalities between rural and urban areas. So you get pushes and pulls. And that, in fact, the terminology related to push and pull dates back to the 1960s when these theories were first put forth. The dual economy models and the Harris-Todaro model, which you may have heard about. But in parallel to that kind of thinking, there were thinkers on the left who analyzed migration from a kind of Marxist or dependency perspective. And there, migration was seen as an extension of the global capitalist system and structural inequalities. So it was the opposite of the modernization and neoclassical theories. So the left-wing analysts viewed it as a problem. It exacerbated inequalities. And later there were theories that were that evolved from that, like the urban bias theory, which posited that urban areas are favored at the expense of rural areas, and this strips the countryside of resources as well as people, resulting in underdevelopment. So as you can see, there are very, very different positions on migration, and these positions still continue to inform how we think about migration. And if you ask yourselves, you probably fall into one of those camps, like we all do. So somebody called Hinde Haas has very conveniently put together a typology of discourses. So you have the migration optimists on one side and the migration pessimists on the other. So migration optimists tend to highlight everything that's good about migration, and the pessimists highlight everything that's bad about it, and the twain shall never meet. They tend to never really speak to each other. But actually, reality is a lot more complicated than that, as we will see from the evidence that I present today. So before we get into that, I just wanted to touch on some of the concepts related to forced migration, forced labor, and various related concepts that are being thrown into conversations a lot more these days without people fully really ever understanding what they mean, because they are overlapping many times. So forced migration is defined as the movement of refugees and internally displaced people who may be displaced by a variety of forces such as conflict, natural or environmental disasters, chemical or nuclear disasters, famine, or development projects. And a related concept is distress migration, and you hear that term a lot in India in particular. Forced labor, which is related to that, is defined by the International Labour Organization as all involuntary work or service exacted under the threat of a penalty. So there's an element of force there to get people to work for you. Unfree labor includes all forms of slavery and related institutions such as debt slavery, serfdom, corvée, and labor camps, and this overlaps with forced labor. And finally, trafficking is the practice of illegally transporting people from one country or area to another, typically for the purposes of forced labor or commercial sexual exploitation. So when we go through this evidence, I'd like you to think about which one of these terms applies to what I'm describing, and whether it is a very clear application of those concepts to that or not. And of course, I will argue it isn't. It's never black and white. It's always shades of gray. So emerging findings. So recent research in India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Ghana, which we've done under the Migrating Out of Poverty program, shows a more complex reality. So what we find that people are taking calculated risks and accepting degrading work at destination in order to improve their social standing and living standards at home, and over a period of time, I should add. They attach different meanings to different places. So home is the place where all their loved ones are, where they have their kinship networks, and where they have the kind of traditional place in society, whereas work is the place, destination is the place where they earn, and they undergo tremendous hardship, of course, to earn in the informal sector or in low-paid, precarious work. And they have spatially and temporally differentiated strategies for their social and economic development. So all of these strategies have the potential to rework structures of oppression and inequality at home, and this is all hotly debated. So I'll start with some work that I did in India over a number of years in bits and pieces, because I lived in Andhra Pradesh for 12 years. I mean, I'm presenting this under the Migrating Out of Poverty banner now, but it's actually work that I'd done earlier. So I had collected data in Mahbubnagar, Medak district, Hyderabad, and various other places, and talked to workers who migrate for construction work, and they're typically debt migrants, which means that they borrow money from the mestri, who is the tekadar kind of person, and then they get taken to the work site where they work under pretty dreadful conditions. And of course, if you calculate their daily wage rate, it isn't as much as the company is allocating to employ them. So because there are so many intermediaries in between, so the company may say, okay, we're going to spend 500 rupees per day to employ a laborer. By the time the money reaches the laborer in the form of the advance, that may actually be equal to something like 30 or 50 rupees a day. So there's a vast reduction in the amount of money that they're paid because there's so many intermediaries. However, on the other side of that is that the agent pays them a large advance, which at the time that I was doing this work 10 years ago was something like 25,000 rupees. which was hugely valued by these workers, which I'll explain later on. And the agent arranges the transport and accommodation and food for the workers at the working site. And recruiting people in this way actually contravenes Indian labor laws. So it's punishable under the Bonded Labor Act. But none of the agents seemed to be even aware of this. You know, they weren't aware of it, and they didn't seem to care because monitoring of the situation was so weak. And all of the facilities, so-called facilities provided to the workers were the cheapest possible. So they were often transported by truck or at the most by bus, but never anything better paid than that because it would be too expensive. So people are just crammed into buses and those, or trucks, and those long journeys are very difficult, especially for women with young children. The accommodation at destination is appalling as well. There's no sanitation. There's a high chance of contracting infectious diseases. There's a high rate of accidents in the construction industry. And these agents are not registered under the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act either, or the Building and Construction Workers Act, at least the ones that I spoke to. And again, I don't know whether this was intentionally so that they could circumvent all the regulations or whether it was because no one seemed to care. So that was the situation. It may have changed, but I don't know. These are some photos coming up now to give you an idea of the conditions in which they travel and work. So this was a night bus from Mahbubnagar. As you can see, people are climbing up onto the roof, and it wasn't a very nice way to travel, but that was quite a common way of traveling from that village where I was interviewing people at that time. And when they get to urban areas, the conditions in which they live can be terrible. I mean, you can just see from this photograph, there's a woman trying to feed her young baby, and there's stray dogs and rubbish and everything all around her. So it's terrible, and I'm sure you've seen conditions like that in near many construction sites. The construction sites themselves are highly dangerous and precarious, so there's no proper scaffolding. If you look at the picture, you'll see that often you get these bamboo poles tied together, and accidents are very, very common because it's not properly secured, and the ladders may not be that strong. So and the final picture is another one where you can see that there's kind of dangerous electrical and gas equipment which is being handled without protective gear. So anyway, so those are the conditions in which they work, which are not good at all. So this kind of debt migration, should we call it forced or not? Now the debt migration occurs when they are recruited against advances, which you saw that they were. And such migration, especially where brokers are involved, has been perceived as a form of neo-slavery or bondage or forced migration, because it's argued that they are not able to free themselves from that continuous cycle of borrowing, migrating, repaying, and borrowing again. However, when you interview people and talk to them, you see that it's not quite as clear-cut as that. Sometimes these loans are very important because they are used to fund major social expenditure, which is extremely important for them, like weddings or, building a house, if I could call that social expenditure, and generally raising their own social standing in the village society. Now, it does mean, of course, that they are, in a sense, trapped in debt, but so are we. I have a mortgage on my house, and I've bought a house even though I'm in debt and will be for the next 25 years. So, we do need to try and understand whether it's good debt or bad debt. I mean, if it does actually result in impoverishment over the long term, then of course it's bad. But some people do get onto an upward trajectory, and others don't, because there's so many risks in construction. And I would argue that those risks are there because policy is so hostile to migration and not enough support systems have been set up to manage their risk. So when you talk to the workers about the brokers, they recognize that they can't find work without their help. They can't actually find accommodation and food and work regularly without the help of these agents or brokers. So they know that they're being cheated, and they know that it's not the best situation, but left to their own devices, actually coming to the city is a hugely daunting, risky, and expensive thing for them to take on, which many of them can't. And the brokers give them advances when needed, which is much appreciated. And as I said, their debts may be taken out for paying for weddings and other kinds of things that they regard as important, for which banks will not lend them money. So they feel that this kind of migration has improved their credit worthiness and put them on an upward path. So it is important to recognize that there are risks, and we'll come back to that at the end. So now moving on to Bangladeshi workers, I think I'm going to have to speed up. This was a study of Bangladeshi workers going from Chapain Nawabganj, which is a high migration district near the border of India, and a lot of them migrate to Qatar in the Middle East to work as construction workers. Here too, a lot of them are migrating through brokers. And in Bangladesh, brokers are called Adam Bipari, which literally means somebody who is a merchant in human beings. They're trading human beings. So it's a very kind of pejorative term. And the government response to the presence of brokers has been to heavily regulate or eliminate them altogether. But it hasn't succeeded, and these people are flourishing everywhere. And so when we talked to these workers, it emerged that there were many reasons why they were still using brokers, even though it's actually illegal or very difficult to do that because the government's trying to get rid of them. First of all, they find that the legal migration system through the kafala system, which is a system for employing workers in the Gulf countries, is very expensive and difficult for them to access because their skills may not match what the employers are looking for. And what these brokers do is that they help them to kind of get into the market somehow, often not very legally, of course, because there's some kind of illegal practices in the kafala system at destination as well. Secondly, they felt more protected by the moral contract between the broker and themselves that had been witnessed by their families, kin, and with village elders, as opposed to some kind of officially registered intermediary whom they didn't trust. They felt that they trusted their local dalal a lot more than they trusted the person in the city. And third, many of them wanted to get these so-called free visas, which are not tied to a single employer, because under the kafala system, you have to go and work for the employer that you have been allocated, whereas a free visa, which is basically an illegal visa, allows you to just get lost in the system. And they, of course, want to do that because they want to go there and find whatever work they can get. So their strategy is to get there, do whatever job they can get. It might be awful, but their ultimate goal is to find something else. And only the brokers will help them do this. So,
how do they get the free visa?
yeah, the brokers, they get it through, well, the whole entire system is basically riddled with corruption, and that's how, on the other side, at the border, everywhere. So even though the brokers didn't deliver on their promises, in the sense of they may promise them a certain wage, but ultimately the workers find themselves working for something less, and the conditions aren't as good as they were told they would be, they still regarded that migration as a success because they had succeeded in getting across to Qatar and found some kind of work, however exploitative. So it's not an ideal situation, but they felt that they'd got there, and over a period of time they had actually started improving their situation. Again, I would emphasize the fact that this isn't a linear process. A lot of people actually find that they didn't find work after all, and they have to come back home empty-handed. So there are risks, undoubtedly, and again, these risks do exist because the labor employment situation is so tight that it's not serving either the migrants or the employers. It's just created this kind of awful situation. So now rapidly moving on to Ghana. This is a photograph. It's not very clear, I'm afraid, of a domestic worker in a home in Accra, which is the capital city. And domestic work is an extremely important occupation for women and girls from poorer backgrounds migrating to urban centers. And this is true all over the world. As I was saying earlier, there are 63 million domestic workers all over the world, and that's not counting the girls who work as domestic workers. And of course, as you know, it's a huge thing in India now as well, that people are coming, women